Hey, my name is Darin. I'm also a senior designer at Webflow. Unfortunately, Gajik, who is the lead designer of Grid, couldn't be here today because of bureaucracy. So I didn't work with him on the Grid project, but I'm pretty familiar with it. So I'm going to try to do at least half good as job as him to present it to you now. So the main things we're going to focus about, starting from the macro to the micro kind of. First thing is the design process at Webflow, how we build new features, how we think about the stuff we're doing and what our North Star is. Second thing is how we deal with layout abstractions specifically, which is a very big thing for us. And of course, Webflow Grid. First thing I want to check how many of you use Webflow in general. Awesome. And how many of you watched the Grid demo yesterday? Oh, so many of you are fresh, so I have some stuff to show you that you haven't seen. So, yeah, we had our first demo of Webflow Grid yesterday evening, San Francisco time. Starting with the design process of Webflow, and first I'm going to talk about the evergreen nature of the web. Production-oriented design tool, which means that the stuff you work on at Webflow actually reaches your direct consumers. So it's not a prototyping type of tool in a way that the abstractions used in the way you think about your design is directly provided to the people who use it. So this means that if you think about the web, you can browse the very first website that Tim Berners-Lee built today in your modern browser. And this is unique about the web. You can't find this like in any app store or any proprietary tech. Basically, it's hard to find an app that existed like in the first iteration of the App Store. And once it's taken down, you can't really find the content in there. It's gone forever. And the web is very democratic about this. But this adds a bunch of complexity to our work. So basically, we have to have a very long-term vision for what we're building. We have to be certain that the stuff we're building today will work in 10 years, just as the stuff that was built 10 years ago works today, and even much more. So this is very cool about the web, but also very hard to build around. So what I'm going to talk about now is creating visual abstractions around code. And something that we do at Webflow always is start with the spec. We always like to think that we're stepping on the shoulders of giants. Instead of coming up with our own abstractions and trying to figure out stuff ourselves, we're stepping on top of the industry standards, which are what the W3C is creating and providing, basically the masters of the internet. So yeah, we do believe that standards are the best way to go, and they do give us a lot of confidence that the stuff we're building is here to stay. And even if we don't know what's coming in the next 10 years, we can feel certain that if someone knows it, it's the W3C, so we do trust them. Another thing I want to discuss is, like as an interlude to CSS Grid and Webflow Grid, is a shift from child-based to parent-based layouts. Something I think a lot of you have been thinking about while working with Flexbox. If you think about the very early ways of doing layout, it was mostly based on floats, and you had to manually provide a sort of layout model to each child element versus something like Flexbox, where most of the properties you actually provide are attached to the parent. And if you think about it, this is very tightly related to the dynamic nature of the web. When we were building like static websites in the 90s, we had complete control over every child element, and they never changed. But right now, designing something like a dynamic search or something that's tailored to your user and changes content, you can't know how many children you're going to have. You don't know what types of children you're going to have. You can have all sorts of crazy scenarios, and that's why the layout abstractions are moving towards parents. And CSS Grid is an even bigger example for that. But if you're familiar with Flexbox, it's pretty much similar. And yeah, something I already mentioned is just trusting the spec. There's also a big upside to this, is that the code that Webflow is outputting is actually very semantic, and the way it works is pretty similar to what a good front-end developer would actually write. Personally, I used to hand code all my websites, but to be honest, I use Webflow for everything now, just because the code that it does provide actually is better than the code I used to write. And yeah, so I prefer working on the tool to write the code for me versus just writing it myself and being up to date with every spec. We do this for you. And something very interesting is that visual abstractions and direct manipulation, which is the main thing about Webflow, are something that's happening across the whole industry. And if you look at this, I guess most of you have seen this. This is the CSS Grid Inspector in Firefox. So CSS Grid is one of the first specs that actually has its own visual abstractions in browsers. And you know why that is? There's a very good reason for this. The spec is very complicated. It's meant to be consumed by a visual UI. Actually, the way W3C built it, in the spec, there are intentions for it being consumed primarily through visual abstractions. And like doing something like this is totally easy doing by using the canvas. But handwriting the code, it takes a very abstract way of thinking to nail it the first time, especially if you're building a complex website or layout. Personally, I can't come up with the exact code for a complex grid just without making a few mistakes first. And that's not a great creative process. So this is direct manipulation. And I think something that illustrates our North Star, where we really want to be at Webflow, not just for grids, for everything we build, is kind of this graph. So going from the left to the right is ease of use. So the tools to the left will be kind of hard to use, and the tools on the right will be easy to use. And if you look on the y-axis, are tools that are not so smart. So you have to do stuff manually, and you have to think a lot and basically drag a lot and move stuff a lot. And tools in the top are smart. So the way we think about it, like design tools, are kind of easy to use, but they're not so smart. You have to drag everything, position everything, resize. You're basically doing the computer's work instead of doing your designer work. If you think about code, it has infinite possibilities, of course, but I'd say most people don't use code at this level because it's very hard. Like, complexity grows exponentially. With the more complex stuff you build, the more complex it gets. And if we really want Webflow to be here, we want to provide the full opportunities that code gives you and make it much easier to use than design tools. And I'm going to show you a few demos today that I think CSS Grid is the penultimate example of what we're trying to build. And I guess you've seen this. If you're like a Webflow fan, we really like to use this example. We believe that moving towards direct manipulation is not something specific to the web or design. We believe this is like an evolutionary thing for all tools. And if you think about it, like the super complex workflows of animators, photographers, like those people aren't centering divs. They're building reverse simulations. They're making extremely complex stuff, building games, making 3D movies. This is much more complex than building flat layouts. And they still have visual tools, but in the web and product world, we still tend to think that the only pro way to do stuff is with code. And we really don't agree with that. We think just that the web and product industry is younger, and it hasn't had its kind of shift towards this. So we believe that a web designer should work in something like this, and not something like this. And this is actually Webflow. So I'm going to move on to Webflow Grid, which is the main topic of today's deck. So what is Webflow Grid? I guess most of you have an idea, but just to make sure, Webflow Grid is basically a layout mechanism for arranging stuff in columns and rows. And it's very simple and intuitive. I'd say it's the simplest abstraction at Webflow currently, and also the most powerful, which is a pretty good win. It's used primarily through on-canvas manipulation, which is also, like, it's much more canvas heavy compared to something like Flexbox. You can do most of the complex stuff on the canvas. It's focused towards easily created common web layouts, but also towards creating very complex and very unique layouts. And with CSS Grid, we believe we're kind of, I'm sure most of you have heard this discussion that the web is getting boring and it's getting kind of the same. And even though Flash was a bad technology, we did have a lot of interesting and kind of memorable experiences on the web in the 90s, and now like many websites do the same. So we believe that CSS Grid would allow people to come up with completely new layouts that are also semantic and accessible and don't rely on absolute positioning. And of course, as I mentioned, Webflow Grid is completely powered by CSS Grid. So like each exploiter code, it's semantic. Whatever happens after Grid will be completely compatible, just how CSS Grid is compatible with Flexbox and floats. Basically, every layout abstraction we've launched so far is still in Webflow. We haven't broken any sort of layout mechanism we've had. So even if you build a website in Webflow, like on day one, it's still the same. And not a lot of tools can say that. And we think that actually Webflow Grid is the best way to use CSS Grid. We're definitely sure it's better than hand coding it, and we think it's the best way to discover, learn, and get familiar with CSS Grid. It simplifies these sort of patterns, which are very familiar, like a split screen, like a big hero section with a grid under there, and also like having a sidebar and all these common layouts. But it also allows you to do much more crazy stuff. Like one of the things in CSS Grid that's new is the ability to overlap stuff without actually having to do complex stuff. It's part of the spec, and it doesn't require absolute positioning, and it's semantic also. And now I'm going to do a few demos, which I think illustrate the point much better than I can. All right, so let's open Webflow, and yeah, I have some special stuff in here that probably don't have, but we don't have soon. So we're going to try to recreate, basically let me set this up, we're going to try to recreate some layouts that you you've tried to build and have built with Flexbox and the floats and everything. And I want you to think about how much time you spent building them last time that you built them. What sorts of abstractions did you use? What sorts of classes did you create? And in general, how was the experience compared to what we're going to do now? So let's see what we're trying to build here. We're trying to build this. Looks pretty simple, like to a graphic designer, but if you work on the web, you know that this can take a bunch of work. Like just having the proper gaps between the stuff takes a bunch of classes. You have to use negative margins to account for the left and right edge, and you have to do a bunch of stuff to the children. Right? So I'm just going to try to do it with CSS Grid. I cannot do this. Also, QuickFind, I guess you all already used QuickFind. It's like the Alfred of Webflow. It allows you to do a lot of stuff without using your mouse, which I enjoy a lot. So we're going to drop in a grid element, which is new. Not here. All right, and this is how our grid UI works initially when you drop it in. It's the same as getting a div or any element and giving it position. A display grid is the same, but we have a pre-made component. So let's say that this layout requires how many? Like 1, 2, 3, 4 columns, and I guess 4 rows. So what should we do? We'll just create 4 columns and 4 rows. The same way you think about it, there's no more complex abstraction. Then just drop this here and just resize it. It snaps to the grid areas. You can't drag it to a place where it's off, like in absolutely positioned design tools. You can only drop it within the grid area. So what's next? The fish. And yeah, you can draw the fish here and resize it. And then we have this. Then we have this. And this one is a bit bigger and vertical. You can drag it here. And that's it. Like, I didn't even do classes right now because I wanted to do it faster, but I didn't have to do anything to the children. You notice that? And if you look at the navigator, there's no wrappers. So everything that's nested in the grid is first level children, and there's no need to use wrappers. You can also reorder the stuff in the navigator and have a different visual order. So you can keep your navigator order accessible and logical, but you can have different sorts of layouts and orders visually without affecting this. And I'm going to also show you a bunch of other cool things here. So let's go back to the style panel and go to my grid and hit enter. So I can see my grid template. You see how everything's aligned here. So imagine that with like older tools on the web, you tried to change the spacing between those. It would take a bunch of work and a bunch of work with the negative margins as well. Yeah, but here, just drag. And it just works. Also drag like this. And it still just works. Like there's no complexity. And we can even hold shift and have uniform gaps, which we always want. Like, how many websites have you seen where it's just annoying that the horizontal and vertical gaps are different? And that's not the fault of designers. It's just easy to mess this up compared to design tools. So we try to believe that Webflow Grid is just as easy as grids in design tools and just as powerful as code. Because it doesn't allow you to make mistakes, things being off the grid, but it also allows you to drag and have free-form direct manipulation on the canvas. So yeah, personally, I think it's pretty cool. So we're going to try to do another layout here, which is our dog newspaper. Yeah, you can look at the text, it's actually pretty informative, and yeah. Okay, so we want to recreate this. Like doing this with Flexbox would be much harder. I'm not sure if it's even possible in the way we're going to do it now. So, like, what's this grid? What do you think? It's like, it has 3 columns, and there's 3 rows as well. But there are many different ways to do it. Like, that's the other thing. Grids work in many different ways, and you can achieve the same results however you think about it. There's no one way to do it. So again, we're going to drop in a grid. Let's create 3 here and 3 here. And let's start with our feature. Yeah. Let's drag it. All right. No, wait a sec. I forgot to. Yeah, something I wanted to show you first is the way you resize columns and rows. As you can see, we have these handles here. You can grab. And this one can be 2FR. If you look at those units, they are FR units, which means like the free remaining space. It's not like percentage, it's actually remaining space. So it's proportional. So let's work with this grid now. Yeah, I forgot the third one, right? Okay. So let's do this. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it's Gajit's design, and I'm trying to make it the same. It would have been easier for him. So, what this? There is always the plug one. Yeah, and this is the featured news, which should be bigger. Yeah, and that's it. It's pretty simple to do. And the cool part about Grid is that all of the abstraction around this layout is saved in a single class. So you can have a class that does this whole layout, and you can attach it to anything. It can have any children. You can provide the children in however you want to. And it's always going to render in this way. Like it's all tagged to a class. So you can have a component which only does a layout. It's like an empty component which is just a grid. And combining this with the power of classes and inheritance, we think this is a very powerful tool. So let's move to a very common example that many of you have seen probably, something that Jen Simmons used a lot, which is this classic jazz poster, which is kind of funky and has a lot of empty space between the content. And I guess most of you know that like doing this sort of spaced out content in CSS is kind of hard. And having all the spacing be uniform and not having to rely on absolute positioning and not having to manually calculate offsets hasn't been on the map so far. And let's try to recreate this. So first, we're gonna add our image, our background image, which is like nothing new. So it's this one. I'm not gonna repeat it, and it's gonna be in cover mode. Okay. So let's drop in our grid. And here, let me just take a peek. What do we have? Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 columns and 1, 2, 3, 5 rows. Okay. So 6, 5, and yeah, let's just start putting the stuff in. So we have this thing here. Yeah, we have this thing here. We have this thing here. I guess. Yeah. Kind of hard to remember. But it doesn't really matter. You can put them anywhere. That's not the idea. So we put this here and again. And this thing here, and this thing goes here, and it's wider, and this thing goes. It's okay. And this thing here, and you can see that it doesn't look exactly the same. Like there are some differences. Look at it, and why is that? So first thing, the gaps are different. If we follow the original design of this classic poster, the gaps should actually be, I just noticed, like we cooked it in the background for you. It's 1 pixel and 8 pixels. So, yeah, so now they do align. So this was a very powerful thing we did just now. We can basically fix the gaps for hundreds of children with just a single interaction. There's no need to think about the actual content. And you don't need to have content to do it. You can do it just on the wrapper. So another thing here is that this logo should actually be centered within the track. It's not. So this is pretty similar to Flexbox. We just say like line, and we say center to the child. So every property is also directly applicable to the child. So if you have a standard sort of layout, like everything stretched or aligned to the top, you can override it on a specific child. And the properties are actually shared with Flexbox. If you do know the align and justify properties, they're the same. It's exactly the same and interchangeable between the specs. And one more thing here, this one is big, and it should be kind of smaller, like it should be as big as the content. So we should just say start. Yeah, and that's it. So I don't know if someone tried to persuade me into building this without grid, I would just think of something else to do and not do it. Yeah. And I think this is, again, a very powerful way to build stuff. Like you can see, this is not a standard like marketing type of layout or not a standard UI layout. It's a very, very creative, sort of crazy layout that's still just as easy to do. And we think this is very empowering. So people feeling that these layouts are just as easy to build as those layouts means that people can be more creative and that designers can express themselves without the fear that crazy layouts are actually like bad for users, not accessible, or slow to build. Because none of this is the case here. And yeah, so we're going to switch to some key points from these demos. As you can see, any element can be a grid. You don't need to drag in our grid component. It can be a div. It can be like any tag in HTML. And that can contain children, that is. Also, grid is mostly about the container, similar to Flexbox. In most cases, you don't even need to do specific stuff with the children. You just need to address the parent. Most of the operations are done completely on canvas. We do have everything in the inspector as well. But here, compared to Flexbox, we are much more eager to push users towards using the canvas. Because we believe it's faster, it's more intuitive, and it allows you to drag stuff, which is something that designers are very used to, and something that just feels natural. Also, the cool part is that all the sizing of columns and rows and everything is done automatically for us. If you're writing CSS grid by hand and you just change one number, this doesn't automatically change the others. You have to think about it and still do the calculus. But here, if you drag one, all the others just know what's happening and they do realign or resize. So again, in this way, we feel that Webflow Grid is more powerful than writing grid by hand. Also, the biggest thing that our beta users and the people we've done user tests with and designers at Webflow as well, we found that it's a huge time saver. It's probably the biggest time saver we've shipped so far. Yesterday we even had a question, will using CSS Webflow Grid help me lose weight and spend more time with my children from a customer? And if you think about it, the answer is yes. And what about Flexbox? I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about Flexbox and all this time and stuff you've invested in Flexbox. Does it just go away? And the answer is no, not at all. It's exactly the opposite way. It's not a replacement for Flexbox. If you think about it, they're basically two parts of the same abstraction that the Darin has been shipping. So this is the new type of layouts happening on the web, but they're meant to be used together. If you think about grid, it's two-dimensional. You have the horizontal and the vertical axis, and you can configure them both separately or together. And Flexbox is more for creating single-axis stuff. So stuff that's just horizontal or just vertical. And this is actually a very powerful thing. You can nest flex children within grid columns or rows, and do micro layout with Flexbox. And you can also nest grid inside of grid however many times you like, and have nested grids, which is also a thing. And there's no right way to do wrong or right way to do it. There's no need to think, am I doing it in the best way? Because from the user's perspective, from accessibility perspective, from a design perspective, there's no difference, and we don't want to put it this way. It's easier if you know you have different ways to do it. In most design tools, you have different ways to do stuff. And that's a good thing, because people think in different ways.